Avi Lewis is a documentary filmmaker, journalist, and educator. His 30-year journalism career, he may not want me to tell you it's been 30 years, but his career has spanned directing and producing award-winning theatrically released documentaries like The Take and This Changes Everything, to hosting and reporting for TV networks worldwide, including City TV, CBC, Channel 4 in Britain, and Al Jazeera English. In 2015, he was the co-author of the LEAP Manifesto, which many of you in this room are probably well aware of. And he's also been deeply involved in the emergent frame down in the United States of the Green New Deal, including producing an animated short film, Message from the Future, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which has been, I'm told, viewed 12 million times. That's more people than are at this conference. He was also nominated for an Emmy Award, so we have an Emmy Award nominee in the room. That's quite exciting. In the 2021 federal election, Avi was the NDP candidate in West Vancouver Sunshine Coast Sea to Sky, and he is now an associate professor at the University of British Columbia, where his teaching focuses on climate justice and documentary filmmaking. And he's also a member of the executive committee of the UBC's Center for Climate Justice. And I can also just add that Avi has been a longtime friend of Parkland Institute, and we are very happy to have him join us this weekend. Avi.
Thank you, Jason, for that kind introduction, including making me feel old. Awesome way to start. Thanks for that. And special thanks to you, Marilyn, for opening, not just for opening us in consideration of what this weekend brings, but also all the work that you've done and that you talked about, and the relationships that you've built. Very, very meaningful for me to stand at this podium after you. Not so bad to have your nephew, Lewis, beside you. I'm very, very honored to be here with you. I liked what you said about being free-spirited and speaking freely. I think I might just take you up on that. I always feel good when I'm on Treaty 6 territory. I've always had incredible experiences here, despite the fact that my name has occasionally been used as an expletive in this province. I want to start with gratitude for the framing of this conference. We are at a crossroads, one of those moments of tectonic shift, existential threat and potential. One of those moments that feels like a turning point we'll be looking back at in years to come. I know you feel it too. To me, it's one of those moments when what we say and what we do really matters more than ever. And so what I'm going to do, departing from the advertised theme, is spend much of my time here with you surveying this new terrain that we've been in for the last 42 days, since October 7th. This moment of collective and contested trauma and pain that we suddenly find ourselves in, and the huge stakes that I believe this moment lends to any shared progressive project going forward. Of course, I won't completely let the conference down in the last act of my remarks tonight. I will shift gears and turn to the rich feast of policy wonkery that we're going to enjoy together over the next 48 hours. I have some framing thoughts that I hope will be useful. In particular, I want to reflect on the kind of political path and power that we need to build together in order to take the policy visions articulated by the fabulous speakers at this conference. I don't know if you've looked at the program, but we got the cream of the cream here, folks. It's going to be an amazing weekend. And to turn those policy visions into real and lasting change, to transform the material conditions in which people live and work on these lands. But let's start where we are. And let me start with a question that I believe may be ricocheting around inside of many of you at the outset of this conference. How can we talk about housing and transit and climate and taxes and healthcare without first acknowledging that as we sit here in comfort and safety, Israeli bullets and bombs continue to extinguish life and level buildings in Gaza for a sixth consecutive week. Bullets and bombs and guidance systems and drones that are sold by a handful of rich colonial countries like Canada and the US, and come bundled with diplomatic cover at the United Nations. Because these genocidal war crimes, and I am choosing my language and my words carefully tonight, these crimes in progress are causing shock and outrage and making it seemingly impossible to sleep at night for anyone with the courage to look, really look, at what's going on in Gaza and what happened in Israel on October 7th. It's hard to get clarity through the fog of war rolling out of the conflict zone and blanketing the earth. A thick pall of long-standing Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism blankets our national discourse, where real acts of anti-Semitism, like shots fired at synagogues in Montreal, are conflated with legitimate and morally urgent protest against the actions of the state of Israel. And our governments, at every level, are sticking to a one-sided script, huddling in the supposed safety of condemning terrorism and anti-Semitism while weakly calling for humanitarian pauses in the midst of ongoing crimes against humanity. Our political leaders are once again demonstrating that they inhabit another universe, a mirror world of sterile official facts and calculations utterly detached from the raw emotions roiling the populace. It's a surreal time in so many ways, made infinitely weirder and worse by the reactive, angry algorithms of social media in which too many of us over-marinate. Maybe I'm confessing too much now. For one thing, can anyone remember another prolonged political moment when the universal currency of exchange was suddenly condemnation? Many who have condemned Israel's indiscriminate killing of civilians have themselves faced condemnation for not condemning Hamas first and foremost. Like 1 week in, after October 7th, we were watching people get canceled for condemning the wrong things, or condemning things with the wrong words, or even condemning things, the right things in the wrong order. We're suddenly in a season of mass denunciation, like a meta contest that ends up in the absurd spectacle. And being on a university campus is very relevant for this because it's happening most at universities, where people are denouncing the denunciations found in statements that have now themselves faded into the denunciatory sunset and are like 3 weeks ago and no longer matter. I mean, I get it. I think all of this lashing out is understandable, and it's a consequence of the fact that we all feel so powerless, watching a continuous loop of atrocity on our screens, or strenuously avoiding watching those atrocities, which exacts a psychic toll in a similar way. Because whether we're furiously avoiding or indulging in the horror, we're all absorbing a vast quantity of unspeakable violence into our very bodies without having any way to discharge it. So we post and post, or we scroll and scroll, and yet nothing seems to erase the nightmare images from inside our closed eyelids. And there's so much fodder for nightmare to go around. Parents executed in front of their children, children executed in front of their parents, thousands of lives snuffed out, thousands more trapped under rubble, dying slowly, with more rubble and more victims being created faster than any rescue attempts can possibly keep up with, especially with no power, no water, no fuel, no food. You can see how people are experiencing this searing collective shock in the ever-growing multitudes of people on the street. Anyone here been to a demo in the last few weeks? Thank you. Thank you. We're in a moment now, suddenly, of mass protest and maybe the birth of a new peace movement that I find heartening and is in itself an important political juncture. This spreading revolt is calling relentlessly and powerfully for a ceasefire. And of course, that has to just be the start. The ceasefire call needs to expand to the demand for a political resolution to that entire conflict and its root cause, the untenable occupation and apartheid policies of Israel. Let me pause here for a quick disclaimer. If there are those of you in this room, fellow progressives, who are uncomfortable with the kind of language that I'm using, words like apartheid and genocide, used to describe the actions of the state of Israel, I want you to at least know that I don't use them merely to provoke. I don't seek to use this platform, and it's an honor and a privilege to be up here, to attack those with whom I disagree. I think there's plenty of that going around at the moment. I guess this is a kind of a trigger warning of sorts, because if you're already upset by what I've said, I think it's going to get worse. I just want you to prepare yourself, or maybe this is a great moment to check your voicemail and take a stroll through the corridors. I certainly wouldn't judge you if you didn't want to be part of this. But I feel an absolute moral obligation to name this moment from my own Jewish perspective. The perspective of one of those people whom Israel says it is keeping safe by reducing Gaza to a bloody ruin. And that means saying that 75 years after the foundation of the State of Israel, which meant the expulsion of some 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, Israel must be made to abide by international law. And that means that Palestine must be liberated, not just from war and siege, but from illegal settlements, from the demolition of houses and olive groves, from checkpoints and outposts and administrative detention and second-class roads and services and the absence of the right to assemble, the right to free speech, the right to free movement. Palestine and Palestinians must be free. Saying these things aloud in public feels incredibly important right now. Here in Alberta, at a conference of the Venerable Parkland Institute, as progressive organizers, as policy nerds, as researchers and activists, we have to come to grips with this historic moment. We have to identify the fundamental messages that it is telling us and try to articulate how we can build a new political possibility out of this inflection point in national and international affairs. And I think there are some powerful connections to be drawn. But rather than offering a whole lot of analysis, I'd actually like to speak personally about these things for the next few minutes. And I do so with some actual nervousness. I've never spoken publicly at length about my own relationship to Israel, to Zionism, and to anti-Semitism. But I feel that this is the moment when I must do so, and I hope I'm right in guessing that this is the right room in which to disclose and speak my truth. And I also feel, I certainly hope, that there are a lot of Jews of my generation who have had similar experiences or who are on a similar journey. I feel called in this moment to stand up as a Jewish person and say, not in my name. Never again means never again for anyone. And that's important because I can see that this moment of violence and atrocity in Palestine and Israel is in danger of splitting progressive movements and organizations, as many Jewish progressives are visibly seized right now by a kind of atavistic conviction that anti-Semitism is to be found everywhere there is solidarity with Palestinians, that hatred of Jews is lurking in every chant and demo and direct action calling for ceasefire. To be clear, I don't think that's happening. I don't think that's happening at all. There is, of course, anti-Semitism surging at this moment, like the dehumanization of Palestinians is surging. Any incidence of hatred of Jews or Palestinians has to be called out, cannot be tolerated, especially in progressive and left-wing spaces. But for me, these amped-up expressions of fear on the part of some progressive Jews are jarringly at odds with who is being targeted and bombed and killed and erased right now. That's not happening to Jews here in the diaspora. It's happening to Palestinians in Gaza and with increasing ferocity on the West Bank as well right now. And my own conviction, as I've thought about anti-Semitism for my whole life, and the extreme Zionist groups like CIJA like to call me an anti-Semite, which is something they regularly do to Jews who don't subscribe to Zionism. I believe that fighting anti-Semitism cannot be pried apart from other anti-racist struggles. The fight to dismantle hatred of Jews belongs in a big, broad fight against racism and ongoing colonialism in all forms. Thank you. Of course, every prejudice based on an identity has its unique qualities and its particularities, of course. But we are stronger when we fight together, and that there's a core to intolerance that has to be confronted across differences. Just like Marilyn was saying, that we have an obligation to find other people from other countries and other traditions and work together with them. That's the only way change will ever come. So as you might have guessed by now, I'm not a Zionist. At this point, if I had to choose a label, I would probably call myself a post-Zionist. Because like most Jewish people, I've had a lifelong engagement with the politics of Zionism, one that has shifted over the decades. And this reflects the fact, and maybe some of you know this really well, I think a lot of you may not know this. Zionism has a history as a contested ideology within the global Jewish community. In fact, my family's political tradition, going back to like the 1890s, was once locked in a battle against Zionism. My grandfather, David Lewis, who worked with Lewis and Cardinal and many others here and across the country, you know he was an early leading figure in the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. He was the general secretary of the CCF from 1936 all the way to 1950. My memory of him really was later when he was a founding figure in the NDP and its transition from the CCF, and he was federal leader for 4 years in the early 1970s. And David's politics around Israel, Palestine moved back and forth across the Zionist line at different points in his life. But he was brought up in the tradition of the Jewish Labor Bund, which was a socialist movement of the late 19th and early 20th century in Russia and Eastern Europe. Now, the Bund was a remarkable organization, worthy of the new interest it now enjoys. Bund is kind of hip among the young socialist kids. I don't know if you all know that, but it's a thing. It's a huge influence on my own ideas about how change happens and what's required for fundamental change. I'll try to summarize it from my own perspective. You could think of the Bund as an entity that was at once a social movement, a trade union, a political party, as well as a cultural and artistic movement, and yeah, they also had a militia. David Lewis's father, my great-grandfather Moshe, was a leader of the Bund in his town of Svisloj. I think it would now be in Belarus. And at the time, the Bundists were sworn political enemies of the Zionists, who wanted to depart the European landscape of anti-Semitism and build a Jewish state in Palestine. Bundists disagreed vehemently with this idea. It was a core principle of Bundism, this notion they had called Deutkeit, or here-ness. The idea was that Jews should fight for revolutionary change where they lived and where they worked and had roots. It was a vision of building power for a socialist transformation of society within the existing body politic, as part, a visibly Jewish part, but still a part of what we today might call a multiracial, multi-generational movement. Now, this obviously didn't fit in any way with the vision of Zionism. And so there were fierce debates, sometimes escalating to physical conflicts between the two groups. There was even a cheeky Bundist song, Oi ihr narsche Zionisten, oh, you foolish little Zionists. And I will spare you the mournful melody, although I could probably do it. But the key couplet of the song goes like this. You want to take us to Jerusalem, to die as a nation. We'd rather stay in the diaspora and fight for liberation. Kind of song I could really get behind these days. But my family has a strong tradition of Zionism in it too. I bear an Israeli name, Avi. And that's my name because my mom spent her 18th year on a kibbutz in Israel. And her youthful imagination was captured by the idea that Jews could build a socialist utopia in the desert. Unfortunately, there was already people there. And it took a long time for many socialist Jews to undo that programming and understand and come to grips with that reality. My mom is one of them. She's come a long way in her own journey. She recently spoke at a panel about Canadian media and Palestine put on by Independent Jewish Voices. Apparently she brought the house down, so that gives you an idea of where she's landed in her relationship to this ideology. As for me, personally, my own story seems entangled with fate, or at least historical coincidence. I don't know. I've never talked about this before. But I was born on May 15th, 1967. It's a doubly important day in the history of Israel-Palestine. May 15th, my birthday, is Independence Day in Israel, the same day that Palestinians commemorate as the Nakba, or catastrophe, the day of the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And that particular May 15th that I was born on in 1967 was almost exactly 3 weeks before Israel took over East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan in the Six-Day War. In other words, the occupation, the longest ongoing military occupation on earth, began when I was 3 weeks old. And as a child of the 70s, I was brought up with all of the powerful myths of Zionism. Israel is a place where Jews could run to for safety if another Hitler ever rose up to extinguish us, as well as the violent colonial lie that it was a land without people for a people without land, a clever slogan that holds a deep colonial erasure within it. I had the early experience of anti-Semitism that reinforced those stories that I was taught as a kid. When I walked through the doors of my first public school in 1973 in Scarborough, Ontario, there was a swastika carved in the front door of H.A. Halbert Elementary School, about a half an inch thick in the wood. And it stayed there for the whole year as my sister and I were terrorized and bullied by an anti-Semite and his crew. When I was 18 years old, I can remember still carrying those inherited positions and searching for my own path. I imagined when I was an 18-year-old that if there were another war in the Middle East that I would go and fight nobly for Israel. Such is the power of the Western heroic narrative in all its colonial glory. I'm not proud of that fact, that moment, but it's part of my formation. And it's part of the formation of a lot of Jewish progressives who are at various stages in this journey of coming to grips with the colonial ideology with which we were imprinted. I mean, early in my adult life, I began to learn. I learned things like my bar mitzvah gifts. You get a little certificate, this tree was planted in your name in Israel by the Jewish National Fund. Those trees were blooming on the sites of Palestinian villages that had been emptied and razed in 1948. Imagine learning that, as I did, that the erasure of Palestinian life was literally being greenwashed in my name. My education deepened in the 90s, in the late 90s, when I hosted a show called Counterspin, a nightly televised debate show. Thank you very much. Thank you. Feeling old, very old tonight. It was a debate show on CBC News World in the late 90s, and one of the big issues that we debated countless times on that show was the negotiation of the Oslo Accords. And I remember those debates keenly. It was argued by many of my most convincing guests on the show that Israel had no intention of trading land for peace, and that the Oslo Agreement, far from its stated goal of leading to a two-state solution, would actually lock in Israel as the only state. And I think that the situation today is overwhelming proof that that was exactly the case. 2 days ago, Israel blew up the Palestinian Parliament building in Gaza. It's like a crushing exclamation point to that argument about there being no desire for another people and another nation state in that land. And I've been to Gaza, and it was another turning point in my own education. It was in 2009. It was 6 months after the devastating bombardment that they called Operation Cast Lead. I was there with my press pass as a member of the media. It was confusing that they let us in, because I was traveling with my partner, Naomi Klein, who at the time was one of the most well-known Jews on earth who had publicly joined the call of Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law. And also with us was our friend Cecily Saraski, who at the time was the deputy director of JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace. Have you seen those spectacular occupations of Capitol buildings and Grand Central Station, the Statue of Liberty that have been organized by Jews against genocide in the US in these past weeks? That's the work of JVP. And that trip was unforgettable in so many ways. The people we met, the extraordinary generosity, the level of discussion around the most magnificent dinner tables with people who had massive challenges putting together those meals, I have no doubt. You know, we met Gazans who had lost their entire family in a single explosion 6 months before. We walked past government buildings in the center of Gaza City that had been reduced to rubble It was a brutal foreshadowing of the situation today, in which most of northern Gaza and vast swaths of the south, the built environment and the civil infrastructure of Gaza have been just leveled. At the end of that trip, leaving Gaza, I even had an encounter with Hamas. I guess you would call them Hamas border guards. Not your traditional idea of a border, though, and the guards were just basically guys in tracksuits with guns. So between Israel and Gaza, there was a wide, scrubby no man's land with a chain link fenced-in corridor between. At one end was Israel, the Erez checkpoint, which is like a mammoth concrete structure that was built to process at least 10,000 Palestinian workers a day, except that Gaza was put under siege and the cheap labor was mostly locked on the other side of the wall. So this terminal was almost entirely unused. At the other end of this chain link corridor was the Gaza side, where the border was a shipping container, empty except for a battered desk with the two guys behind it and a metal chair where I sat for about 45 minutes as they questioned me. It was tense and it was scary. There was confusing talk about how they were going to vaccinate me before they let me leave the container. I was not excited about that. Mostly they were stuck on the fact that I had a Canadian passport but an Israeli name, and they were utterly uninterested in the two women that I was traveling with. And eventually they kind of let us through. My experience with the Israeli border was as asymmetric as the two structures themselves. And I won't tell you the long version, but after many, many hours of waiting in a concrete maze outside an elevator with no call button, it was just an elevator. You understand your powerlessness in the architecture. You don't press a button, you wait. And we waited for hours and hours and hours as it got dark. And then finally it just opened and we were let in to be processed. It was like being the only travelers in a giant empty airport. And once again, the officials showed almost no interest in Naomi and Cecily. The casual misogyny was the thread that connected the two very different experiences. I was taken up to the very top floor of the facility, down corridor after corridor to a corner office, where I was introduced to the commander of the entire checkpoint. I think he was a brigadier general, if I recall correctly, who took me to the window and pointed out at a squadron of tanks that was moving around in formation, which we could see. And he said, "We know you don't like us. You're against what we do. But do you have any idea how much danger you were in going in there? We were mobilizing a whole army division to go into Gaza and rescue you. Yeah, even though you hate us, we would still save your life because you are a Jew." And I've been processing those 4 words for about 14 years. In the moment, they felt like they felt like a manipulative mindfuck, you know? It didn't help when he added, "And keep your woman under control, you know? She's going to get herself in trouble one of these days." He doesn't know her, he doesn't know me. I almost took a chance and just thought about hitting him. He was heavily armed, of course. Felt like barf, right? And also, how revealing. A whole worldview was transmitted in that short exchange. Patriarchy? Check. The victim become victimizer? Check. The power of those with the biggest guns to rank human life, who matters and who doesn't? Check. The message to me has become clearer and clearer over the years. He was telling me that my life had intrinsic value, that I was special, that I was worth a huge amount, that I would be protected, resources would be mobilized, lives would be risked because my life, my Jewish life, was so precious. Even as a dissident who denied my birthright, I was among the chosen. And that's the same message that Israel has been sending in response to those gruesome attacks and murders of civilians on October 7th. The apocalyptic fury of retribution and collective punishment. On one level, it's just to send that message that Israel will take 10 Palestinian lives for every Israeli life taken. That's the exchange rate. This is not just exceptionalism. The only word for it is supremacy. A worldview that sees some human beings as inherently valuable while others are less than human. Human animals, as Israel's defense minister said. Children of light versus children of darkness, as its prime minister said. It's the violent logic of colonialism. It's the logic that leads to genocide. It's also, and this is where I connect these experiences and this narrative to my whole life's work and why we're gathered this weekend. It's the logic that underlies our whole broken global system today, with epic inequality across human society, allowing a handful of all-powerful corporations to continue their grotesquely profitable ways, even as those practices methodically destroy the life support systems for all living things on our shared planet. It's the logic that drives the climate emergency, that sustains a pattern of production and consumption in which the countries and communities that have done the least to cause the crisis have long been living its harshest impacts. There's a brilliant climate justice think tank called the Climate and Community Project, which summed it up with compact precision in a powerful statement calling for ceasefire last month. Here's the quote that will ring through the years for me. Apartheid is incompatible with climate justice and inevitable without it. So what that's saying to me is that unless we rapidly build the power to win a world in which every life is equally valuable, the powerful will keep stoking every crisis while building their fortresses and armed life rafts to which they plan to escape the hell that they're creating for the rest of us. That basic value, that every human life is precious, that our fates are intertwined, that has to be the basis of all our action on every issue in every fight. And that, by the way, that's why I make no apologies for mourning the loss of Israeli civilian lives on October 7th, both because those horrific killings impacted people that I love directly, but also because I don't think any of us should succumb to the cheapening of life, of any life, because that makes us too much like those we are resisting in this new peace movement that we are building right now. And this is where I think the current moment of bombing and bloodshed, of surging intolerance, but also surging solidarity, this is where I think the fight for the world we want, to circle back to the conference frame, can really find new footing, and I hope new power. This is where, for me, we can and we must start to talk about housing and transit and taxes and healthcare and climate by recognizing that what unites these fights, what grounds our common struggle, is that most fundamental value that we share. The fierce, relentless, and morally consistent assertion that every life is precious. Everyone deserves housing. Everyone deserves healthcare. Everyone deserves a place where not just humans, but more than humans can live. We're in a fight for life, for the right of all beings to live a life of decency. Those are the existential stakes of our struggle. And the current violence and its ripples around the world have to re-ground us in that basic truth. Whether it is non-market housing or revived public health care, climate justice or reform to our broken electoral system, whether it's indigenous sovereignty, we have, all of us, agency and a role to play in the fight for life, against the logic of profit and warfare and suffering as an unfortunate externality in a system that presents itself as inevitable, but we know can and must be transformed. And so as we look ahead to the sessions to come this weekend, and I will be around all weekend, so if you feel I've strayed too far, I expect you to take me to task. As we look ahead, I also think it's worth sort of grounding us in the moment where we are, beginning with an honest assessment of where we're starting from, and acknowledging that we're not doing particularly well in that fight. You know, if we're honest, as we look at the balance of forces in society, even before this current historic moment, we on the left have not exactly been winning. Can we say that? Can we admit that as we are together in this safe space? Whether it's the housing emergency or the climate emergency or the spiraling cost of living crisis, driving vast numbers of people into economic desperation, The food bank at U of A is experiencing unprecedented demand and fighting to keep up with it. The defunding and increasing privatization of public services from transit to education to healthcare, we have not, as a society, been making a lot of material progress lately. Which, of course, is different from saying there's no hope or that there aren't hopeful signs, that there aren't latent conditions from which momentum could quickly shift. I think there absolutely are. It feels like everything is at play right now. And we're in a time of massive change and sudden change. And things could flip very quickly. And I think the value of a conference like this weekend's is we need to be ready. If we get a shot at putting some of these ideas into practice, we gotta be ready. We have to be united, we have to be organized, and we have to know what the agenda is and be ready to implement. But we have to be honest about the need to create gigantic change that benefits the many, not the few. And we have to be ready to do it across all sectors at once, because that's what's now required. And the longer that we as a society delay making really big changes, the bigger the change will be that we have to make, and the less time we'll have to make it. As in so many things, the whole like getting off fossil fuels and getting our emissions down is exhibit A on this front. The line of what's required gets steeper and steeper the longer we fail to act. And that's how it is, I think, on almost every front. I want to share a few thoughts about why I think that is and some directions and strategies that we might consider to turn things around. I want to focus on what I hope are concrete and helpful reflections in this moment and not merely indulge in bemoaning the sad state of things, although it's hard to resist. I mean, if we just wanted a litany of the barriers to transformation and the zeitgeist, there are all kinds of conditions we could cite. You know, like the lack of a large, vibrant institutional left in this country. Man, it would be nice to have one of those. The collapse of faith in collective change led by governments. That'd be handy right now. An information zone that we all swim in, which Steve Bannon would proudly observe is flooded with shit. In our federal political class, the exhausted and flailing federal neoliberal liberals with their same old corporate sycophancy painted on top of an increasingly chipped and fading progressive rhetorical veneer. The soaring poll numbers and the triumphant success of the rising populist right with its billionaire superfans and newfound working class appeal. A freshly painted gleaming veneer on the same old axe the tax, small government, big business bullshit that the right has been trotting out since Reagan, for heaven's sake. And the NDP, okay. As a once and future federal candidate, I hope, of a future federal candidate, I of course will not fully unburden myself on my own view of the party's shortcomings. Give me credit for a little bit of diplomacy tonight, thank you. But at the very least, I think it's fair to observe that the NDP is somewhat contaminated at present by a toxic cloud of secondhand Trudeau hatred, thanks to the Supply and Confidence Agreement, that thin piece of paper that threatens to bind the party's fate in the next election to that of our incredibly unpopular Prime Minister. At the same time, I have to say it's worth noting that the NDP is the only major national party calling for a ceasefire day after day and with real passion on the floor of the House of Commons. I hope you've been checking that out. I've been moved by the passion shown by this caucus. And it seems that the NDP federally may be on the verge of winning much-needed federal anti-scab legislation and even maybe, just maybe, single-payer pharmacare. And I was really heartened to see that the party very publicly at the convention in Hamilton, recent convention in Hamilton, drew that red line and said, if it's not single payer, truly public pharmacare, then we're out of this agreement. That's what we needed to hear. But still, the barriers to big change are substantial and well known. So let me share 3 high-level observations about what I think we're missing and what I think we need to do and what we can start doing this weekend together to cross the cold expanse of political deep space and start winning, which is the goal. And in keeping with my current political positionality, I guess you'd say, straddling the boundary between social movements and the electoral system, I'm framing these thoughts in my own way as a sort of an inside-outside dynamic, because that's where I'm living right now, and that's where I see the most interesting political possibility. So first, on the inside, we obviously suffer from a striking lack of vision among political parties and the progressive sectors of the political class. We are missing a bold set of solutions to intersecting crises that, taken together, tell a story of the future that we want to live in. Solutions that are big enough to actually solve the problems that we face and straightforward enough to communicate quickly without technocratic jargon. I don't see any political party at any level anywhere that is able to offer this urgently needed and inspiring vision. A detailed and vibrantly communicated vision like the Green New Deal, an electrifying, galvanizing call to action that soars into the political conversation on the wings of justice and solidarity, connecting the deep emissions reductions that we need with massively expanded universal public services. A vision that foregrounds desperately needed transformations that would create fountains of meaningful family-supporting jobs and work and improve everyday life for everyone. Like a national emergency plan for climate justice that leads with vastly expanded public transit, local food production, zero emissions housing, a nationalized, okay, now I'm going to go for it, a nationalized heat pump and indoor air ventilation industry. You feel me? With publicly owned and unionized manufacturing, training, installation, and maintenance in schools, public housing, rental buildings. I mean, don't get me started on where heat pumps could lead us if we just let them. They look like boxes affixed to the ground, but I'm telling you, they're an engine that will drag us into the future. What we see instead in the political imagination on the progressive side of the equation obviously doesn't feature this level of ambition. Another moment of reality, like I'm not totally in my green dream. Of course, BC is much better off with an NDP government than the alternatives. Alberta was certainly much better off under Rachel Notley than it is today in the hands of true extremists. I mean, you're living with a deranged gong show of a government, launching far-right trial balloons like the Sovereignty Act and pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan. Their trial balloons filling the prairie sky, threatening to blot out the sun. And I accept, of course, that many important reforms and reversals of previous austerity can be accomplished in governments of the center-left, like the latest generation of NDP governments here in the West. But the emergencies that we face are so deep and so dire that incremental improvements or reversals of previous austerity simply do not meet the measure of this historic moment. Whether we're thinking about the emergency in housing, the affordability of basic food and basic goods, the collapsing and shredded healthcare system, or the unraveling climate itself, that looming over and connecting all of the other crises, it's time to go big. It's time to go big. I honestly, on a personal level, as I've kind of turned the corner in my own life and thought about running for office, I don't understand the goal of people who get involved in progressive politics to just be better managers of these systems that are all coming apart at the seams at the same moment. It just doesn't seem inspiring to me. I don't get it. So second, when we look outside the political class to social movements and the policy innovators in the movement sphere, that's where I see the much needed ambition and the vision that is blooming in thrilling ways. The speakers at this conference are going to put on a literal clinic in articulating the kind of concrete policy changes that I've said are missing and sorely needed at the political level. From calls for an historic federal commitment to non-market housing, focused on the public, cooperative, and nonprofit sectors. Check me if I get this wrong, Marilyn, thank you. You've got a society-wide building efficiency and retrofit program that relentlessly targets low-income households. This is one of the ideas that's being floated right now. There's a youth climate corps. Been hearing about this. Great polling out just yesterday from my brother Seth Klein and the Climate Emergency Unit. The idea of a call to action for young people to give a couple of years of their life to work in everything from watershed remediation to climate disaster response to building the infrastructure that we need for electrifying everything and getting rid of emissions. electoral reform and local politics, from wealth taxes to making big oil pay to clean up its mess, which I think is something you know about here in Alberta. We already have the vision and the policy ingredients needed for a big, bold agenda for rapid populist change. What we don't have is the power necessary to get it done. And so third and finally, as I wrap up here, we're lacking, and in my view, we really, really need a coordinated and collective effort to forge an inside-outside political alliance and culture. This begins with a more sophisticated approach, more and better, deeper relationships, and a strategy between movement activists and policy activists and the lawmakers at every level who must come together and pass the legislation that's needed to get effective progressive policy moving. Movements and policy wonks, again, so many of you here in this room have the policies, the sparkling imagination, the tactile and the tactical, the building blocks of big change. Not to mention the messaging and the narrative frames to bring those policies to life in the national conversation and shape them into a political offer that can win, that will be massively popular. But for many working on transformative change outside the electoral system, there's still a skepticism around engaging with politics and politicians. And I get it. As someone who's only been at it for a few years, engaging with political parties can be incredibly frustrating and can feel like a waste of time. Toxic partisanship, the centralization of control that goes along with political centrism, the capacity drain and burnout that people rightly associate with election campaigns, although it doesn't have to be that way, the condescension and head patting that activists and organizers experience when they do engage directly with politicians, none of that feels particularly fun. And from the other side, politicians inside the system struggle to see pressure from movements as constructive and participatory rather than angry and combative. See the culture of denunciation that I was talking about earlier. Some of that is on us on the outside too. But I think there is, or at least there can be, a healthy relationship between inside and outside. And I think it's critical that we all give some time and thought to this dynamic in our organizing research and policy work. When it works, an inside-outside politic can be sophisticated, mature, and constructive. Many movements adopt the attitude of no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, reflecting a principled commitment to work with politicians when they align and not to succumb to the merely transactional or the emotionally manipulative games that often get played. I came for you, you have to show up for me, I'll vote for your thing if you vote for my thing, blech. In the same way, I do see a few politicians in our current system who welcome pressure from social movement groups and use it to push further in their own negotiations with power. I think we've seen that happen around pharmacare just in the last few weeks. And this means that rather than get defensive when movements demand more and faster change, there are some politicians who see it as a way to translate into power, that pressure from outside into power at the bargaining table. You know, I fantasize about Don Davies, the NDP health critic, sitting there across from the Liberal health minister saying, look, minister, you know, with all due respect, our base is going to tear us a new one if we cave into your shitty thing, you know, like, I'm sorry, it's either single payer, fully public pharmacare, or we're out of here. That's the kind of thing that I think we can achieve. And I don't mean that this approach is the be-all and end-all of social change. At this moment, we are seeing a surge of classic grassroots organizing in Canada, and I would just want to pause to appreciate how exciting it is. There's mass protests calling for a ceasefire in Gaza that built quickly to truly historic levels, some gigantic crowds, and not just staying at the level of protest and marches, but escalating into direct action. And those direct actions, smaller by nature, have grown and expanded incredibly fast in the last few weeks across the country. Just a couple of weeks ago were the first occupations of MPs' offices, and from there were weapons manufacturers who sell arms to Israel who've been blockaded by labor activists, and just today the movement organized effectively an occupation of Scotiabank's lobby in Toronto, a big rowdy crowd ready to get arrested on Shut It Down for Palestine Day, which was today. I also think it was a local celebration of Emma Jackson's birthday, as she called for on Twitter. I hope she tells us much more about it with the intercession with Dave Meslin on Sunday. And these are new direct alliances too, in a way, people from different countries of different movements getting together and forming quickly. Silo busting within the world of movements. activists from many different causes, labor activists and climate activists, racial and economic justice folks, migrant rights organizers, all showing up to escalate pressure quickly on banks and weapons companies and ultimately on the political class. So I believe this moment of movement muscle is having some success in fracturing this out-of-touch elite consensus that's shamefully providing political cover for Israel in this moment of horror in Palestine. And these moments of exponential organizing have happened before, and we have to also be wary that in this age of politics at digital speed, they can also evaporate just as quickly, or spark a backlash that elects a Trump or a Bolsonaro or a Poilievre. But as we'll hear from the terrific speakers at the conference over the weekend, let's stay focused on how to take the energy and the creativity and the viral momentum of well-organized social movements and translate it into rapid policy implementation in the political sphere. I just want to drop one more idea as I close here that I found really helpful in the last couple of years, which is the concept of non-reformist reforms. You know, only at a Parkland Institute conference would I even say something like that. You know, a very clunky name for a very elegant idea from a 60s French theorist named André Gorce. And it refers to policies, some good examples would be like public banks or a new generation of non-market housing, reforms that undermine neoliberal orthodoxy, that improve people's daily lives, that build the fighting spirit of those people who benefit from those reforms directly, and point to and are guided by a society based on a different set of values. Many of the ideas that we'll discuss over the next 2 days will meet this definition. And I implore you, with every great proposal that we share, let's spend a little bit of time and energy together thinking about how we will build the power to make it the law of the land. That's an important part of why we're here. It all belongs with those fundamental, it all starts and ends with the fundamental values that we share. The violence that we've experienced, that we've witnessed in real time, reminds us what the stakes are. Apartheid is incompatible with justice and inevitable without it. We have the vision that we need to get the world we want. Our sacred task together this weekend is to get out there and win it. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Avi, for that passionate and deeply personal talk. I think this is getting us started on a wonderful moment. We have a little bit of time for a few questions.
I wonder if the donut has any questions. Does anyone have any questions about the donut? I mean, maybe the donut is just a question. It doesn't have to be an answer. There isn't an answer to everything. Right, yeah. It's the donut.
To bring us together,
There you
in
go,
fact.
it's the donut.
I see it that way. I mean, this is a book by an economist, 2018. Are you aware of Kate
Yeah,
Raworth?
for sure.
Okay.
Kate Raworth's work is very important.
If anything can do it, why not something as simple as the donut?
Yeah.
Kate is big on visuals, and we need a new vision, not perma-erection, growth forever, patriarchy.
Well said.
Yes. We need to live within the donut.
Yeah,
and
big
this
visuals.
is not a difficult thing to convey to people, and it would be something we could really come together around. I like to imagine globally. It shouldn't be that hard. You have a connection to AOC.
A little faded at the moment, but yes.
Okay, but you organized the LEAP, so I know
One
you
of
have
many
huge
people, yep.
capabilities, and
Yeah.
thank you for that valiant effort.
Big fan of the donut economics.
Donut.
Awesome.
Living within planetary boundaries. Science says, right?
Circles, not straight
Inner
lines.
circle is treat our neighbor as ourselves. The golden rule of every religion. We get that out in social media. Simple. How do people argue that?
This is a donut with a theory of change. You're getting it now. Okay, as long as
Read
we're
the
clear on what's
book,
happening.
read the
I
book,
love
but
this. I love
Abby,
this. I just
I
want
would
everyone to
love-
be with the donut
I
program.
mean, you have connections, and I like
Yeah.
to think that the civil society organizations could actually come together, because it's not something that would require a lot of work by any one person. We agree to these simple rules, and then we work on all of our little things, all of our very important things. These sprinkles are supposed to be overlapping. That's the intersectionality.
Ooh, intersectional sprinkles. That's, yep,
See?
very cool. Yep.
There's opportunity. I didn't want to come here tonight in a donut. I have to say I'd have loved to have not made a fool of myself. But if we really legitimately are in a crux point, months, years, to make big change that you talk about,
Yep.
We need somebody to organize this. I don't feel capable to do it, but Avi,
You brought the donut.
you
How much
do.
more can you do? Thank you for that.
I'd love you to reach out to Kate Raworth or.
I've watched all
So,
her YouTube videos. I'm a huge fan of this frame. It's a very
to
helpful
be honest,
reframing
her
of
visuals
economic
are a
change.
little more complicated, right? And I think we could simplify those even more to bring people
Yeah,
together.
but they're not as
So-
big and they're not inflatable. So you got that going for
Lots
you.
of opportunities here
Nice.
for holistic vision and movement and fast movement, like
Thank
you're
you.
saying. So thank you. I could have sworn you were talking about the donut. So
There you go.
yeah, awesome.
Can we have a round of applause for Donut Economics? Who knew we were going to get a whole extra session in here? This gentleman's been waiting.
Just before I was to leave to come to this evening, I received an email from the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. A number of other groups were also included in this, calling for the arrest of Prime Minister Trudeau, Jolly, and a number of other politicians for complicity in the crimes against humanity on the part of Israel.
Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, for those who don't know, is an excellent coalition of different left-wing foreign policy groups in Canada. I think it answers a real need for a new spirit of internationalism in the progressive space. This particular tactic I'm not a big fan of. I love the work that the Canadian Centre for Foreign Policy does. And I think there has to be accountability. An overwhelming majority of Canadians want a ceasefire. People around the world want a ceasefire. Our Prime Minister can't get the word out of his damn mouth. And it's shameful. It's shameful. And Canada's record of voting with the United States and Israel at the United Nations is not a new thing. It's been going on for decades and decades. And it does provide vital political cover for a project that most of the world, especially since October 7th and everything that's been done in Gaza, has really come to realize is a gross violation of international law and must end. And Canada's way out of sync with this. The last piece I did for Al Jazeera in 2010, so that's almost 14 years ago, was a half-hour documentary called Canada-Israel, The Other Special Relationship. And it was about how the new anti-Semitism, as it was branded at that time, was being used to silence critics of Israel, and how there was a long-standing bipartisan consensus between the Liberals and the Tories, and all of governments reaching back a long way to compete to be more and more unquestioningly pro-Israel. The NDP was part of that, under Mulcair especially, was extremely Zionist. And I am proud of the fact that the NDP in the last couple of years has got a much more balanced policy on Israel-Palestine, is finally calling for the enforcement of international law, is finally calling for an arms embargo on Israel until it complies with international law. There's a whole bunch of movement going on within the political class. And I see this email that you got as part of the pushing further in this moment. I don't believe in like the citizens arrest running after politicians and screaming at them tactic. It's a tactic, right? It's not something I would divide with other people whom I agree with on the strategies and the politics.
In reference to your mentioning about people getting into more powerful positions on the part of the left,
Yeah.
just managing better. Just some days ago, I did see a program in which Yanis Varoufakis, I'm sure many people will
Former
know
finance minister
who
of
he
Greece.
was.
Yep.
Ex-finance minister of a left-wing government in Greece. He said that in Scandinavia and Finland, just some years back when there was a financial crisis, they took and nationalized the banks. When the crisis was over, they just turned around and sold them back to private interests.
Yeah. Well, they did put some politicians in jail or some bankers in jail in Iceland, which I think that's more where I'm into bringing citizens arrests, frankly. Let's get some bankers behind bars.
While my partner and I don't read everything, we pretty well know what's been going on in Palestine since '48. I don't understand why so few people of good conscience and intellectual awareness, I don't understand what we're afraid of. Because even with this crisis, and even as the protests have grown on social media and on some of the news feeds that I go to, Tyee, for example, has had a couple of articles about it, but they shut the comments down right away. It says if they're afraid, we can't speak of it, or we might speak of it in ways that will set our hair on fire.
Yeah.
What in God's name are we so afraid of that as educated people, we can see a genocide happening? Our CBC is still afraid to say genocide, But if you roll the film back a few months, we were accusing Russia of it if 5 or 6
Yes.
people were. What is
an
going
excellent point.
on? And is it perhaps that the reality we're seeing now puts us in the West in such a black and evil light that we don't want to completely look? Because I don't understand it. If you could explain, what in God's name are we so afraid of when it comes to social justice?
Well, I do want to answer that directly. I think a lot of non-Jews are afraid of being accused of anti-Semitism. And I think there's a reason for that.
Not Semitic?
Well, that's a different question. I think we can just agree that Palestinians have been dramatically dehumanized and invisibilized in this moment. And we have organizations like CIJA, which purports to be the voice of the Jewish community in Canada, but is actually, in my view, a far-right extremist Zionist group that was formed, I'll give you a little bit of history that most people don't know, by Jerry Schwartz, the CEO of Onyx Corporation, which is a vulture capital fund. You know what they do, they buy up distressed companies, they load them up with debt, strip them down, sell them off for parts, and then drive them into bankruptcy and move on. He bought a company called Chapters and another one called Indigo, which they merged for his wife, Heather Reisman, and they took over in a kind of a hostile corporate takeover many of the liberal Zionist groups and other traditional Jewish organizations in Canada in the 1990s. And there was a forced merger into the Canada-Israel Committee, which became CIJA, which represent much far-right Zionist views and are much more aligned with Netanyahu's party, the party of Likud, and even further right than that. And so you have these institutions in Canadian society which purport to speak for all Jews, but don't. And people who criticize Israel are branded anti-Semites, particularly on the left. Because what people don't understand, and I think is vital to understand in this moment, is that there is an ideological dimension to these accusations of anti-Semitism that are leveled by Zionist groups. They are not out there pulling down every swastika in the convoy protests, although they register some pro forma alarm, right? They are a right-wing movement, and they exist in opposition to left-wing ideas. And the accusations and campaigns and smears of anti-Semitism are directed at left-wing figures, almost exclusively. That doesn't mean there's no anti-Semitism on the left. There is. I've experienced it. It's not at the level that those groups make you afraid of. And I think, it's really important to identify the different actors in this equation. If I was the Tyee, I would shut down the comments too, and I'll tell you why. There's also an info war going on. And there are a lot of people who have a lot of time, some of whom are being paid to get in comments and say stuff and post stuff. There's a lot of propaganda. It's war. I'm not sure I have a big problem with comments, but I do think you're really naming something about the double standards that I think we need to have a more open conversation about in Canada. It's going to cost me to start it in public, and I'm ready. Bring it on. They don't speak for me.
Hi, Avi. I appreciated a lot of what you said, and I can hear the voices that I've heard over many decades in my head at the same time, so I'm sure you understand that.
Thank you for holding that tonight. I know it wasn't easy.
And I've worked for 30 years for the New Democratic Party as an activist, and I'm very proud of the work done by our MP here, Heather McPherson, in calling
She's
for
been
a
awesome.
ceasefire.
I must have hugged her 4 times in Hamilton. I think she was a little off-put by it. I wasn't sure she was expecting it. I was just so grateful for some of the things that she said and done recently.
You were out on the hustings, you were out talking to voters, and when you say we've got to win and all these things, it's about talking to voters.
Yep.
There's a new movement that a lot of people, including in the NDP, are interested in, is deep canvassing. I just wondered if you could just reflect a little bit on your experience of talking to voters and some of the challenges around that, because we just elected another frickin' awful right-wing government
Stunning.
here. And we worked so hard to make it different. Having those conversations with voters is difficult, so I wondered if you could comment on that.
What a beautiful question. And I think that deep canvassing, there's lots of different organizing schools, Marshall Gantz, and various iterations of this kind of deep organizing technique. I think it's come into prominence again as a reaction to the technologizing and the smartest guys in the room problem with electoral politics. And I think that the campaign that was run here in the last provincial election was really obviously focused on a personality comparison and a number of seats around Calgary that were deemed to be pivotal. And so it was not a campaign that was run out of a shared story, out of a sense of values, out of a commitment to deep canvassing, out of a connection with rural Alberta. The CCF didn't have its founding meeting in Saskatchewan, had its founding meeting in the Labour Temple in Calgary. And there are deep progressive roots, even in rural Alberta. I know it's not the surface politics, I get it. Like I know what's going on here. But those places can't be abandoned. And those techniques of actually having longer, deeper connections with voters and building relationship, they are in vogue in movement organizing today, to some extent in electoral canvassing, although more and more it's algorithms, it's identifying support, it's having a very disciplined strategy and going after one thing. She's not Danielle Smith. She's not Smith. Get those ridings in Calgary. It failed. I don't pretend that I would have done it, better, but I think a lot of us watching from the outside were saying, well, what about the fantastic things that you will do? How about speaking to people's aspirations? What is the story of daily life getting easier for folks who have it the hardest? What are we going to do with the existential questions that we're terrified of as the planet warms and as the economy is insufferable for all but the tiniest proportion of people at the top? Those things, that's where we start talking to people who are being captured by the convoy politics. And we have certain things in common. We have certain things that really we don't have in common. But when we start talking about pharmaceutical companies and how Pfizer alone made $50 billion in 1 year from the vaccine, while protecting it from being distributed globally so that people in other places could be protected, that's shameful, and we needed to talk about that, right? Because they hate Big Pharma. Now, they may think that Big Pharma is injecting monitoring devices through the vaccine and stuff that I don't agree is true. But we do have some shared ground. And the more that we leave on the table of these populist issues, and Marilyn and I were talking about this at the beginning, this is not a polite moment in human history. This is a time of big feelings and big problems. And people need to be able to channel their legitimate rage against the powerful. And we on the left and in the NDP need to be doing that. And when we fail to do that, we see young people, working class people, people who care about climate, defecting to the populist right. We have to reverse that flow. And I think the kind of politics that we've been talking about tonight and that we'll talk about this weekend is the answer to how we change that political calculus. But I don't have strong feelings about it apart from that. Yeah.
The mic's over there, I think.
Recently, the Global Edmonton has come out with an article, and it's talking about a grassroots group that is saying that winning is more important than nostalgia. And I was just wondering, when have we ever really focused on winning in this situation? And isn't it a bit of an insult to regard the efforts of liberating working people and assuring justice for working class as nostalgia?
As nostalgia, yeah. It seems like if we're going to live through the 30s again, that might be like a top issue, not a retrospective. I agree with that deeply. Thank you for that.
The events in Israel and Gaza have pretty much dominated international attention for your presentation, but I can't help mentioning, maybe it's a bit of a digression, but that there are a bunch of events, such as in Sudan, that are much worse, have been going on much longer, affected many more people,
Yeah.
and we shouldn't forget about that.
Thank you. Thank you. I was struck right at the beginning, just after October 7th, I had a few conversations with my dad, who was hanging in there against all odds. He was saying that on like the same day, something that crossed his screen was, I might get some of the details here wrong, but in what many are describing as a genocide occurring in Eritrea, that the specific targeting of reproductive organs in women as a weapon of war was now a cataloged phenomenon. And as someone who my dad, spent many decades of his life working on issues in Africa, especially HIV and AIDS, but not only. And he said, here is another unspeakable crime against humanity unfolding, and nobody's going to hear now. So I believe that we have the capacity to hold complexity and even contradiction. We can care about more than one thing at the same time. And my hope is that as Israel-Palestine it is a unique international situation for a lot of reasons, because geopolitical interests are arrayed and have been for a long time in that part of the world. maybe this can trigger a new spirit of internationalism, and we can get out of our very parochial bubbles. I know that in the late 90s, when I came up as a political being, the question of corporate globalization and the movement against corporate globalization and for a bottom-up kind of globalization, the Seattle moment was a time when progressive people across the world, with the help of new technologies like email, were starting to connect and build a global movement. And I feel like since 9/11 in North America and after the Iraq War, the movements against that war, and especially in the last decade or two, we've shrunk back into ourselves in a way that's really dangerous. The pandemic was an opportunity to re-see the whole world. And I think that the lack of a movement for vaccine justice and for really seeing everyone's life as equally precious, like we've been talking about tonight, was a missed opportunity for progressives in the moment of fear, legitimate fear and paralysis of the pandemic. But every time something is happening that people are actually talking about in other parts of the world, we have an opportunity to expand the frame, reach back outside of our bubble, and say, yeah, every life, that means ones that people and communities that live very, very far from here are just as important to us as what is local. And we have the capacity to connect now in ways that we never have before. So thank you for bringing that into this room.
Avi, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jason.
You have started us off on, I think, in a wonderful tone, talking not just about facing what the struggles we have and the horribleness that's happening in our world, but to find a path forward to something that could be better. So thank you, and I have a small token
Love small tokens.
of our appreciation.
Thank you.
And he'll be around all weekend, so I imagine he'd be happy to engage in conversations with you. Just a couple of notes before you leave. Those of you who only bought a ticket for this evening, this is just the appetizer. Sorry, Abby, you're just the
let's
appetizer.
spend the weekend together.
So feel free to go back out to the front desk and sign up for the rest of the weekend. We'd be happy to have you here all weekend.
Don't forget the donations, Jason.
And drop some money off at the same on the way out the door. So tomorrow, we'll kick off the day at 9 a.m. sharp with economist Angela McEwen, and she's going to talk to us about how we can build the economy that we want. Enjoy your evening, get home safe, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning.